And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. We often imagine love as a kind of fluency, the ease of being understood without effort, the comfort of knowing how someone thinks before they speak. But beneath that dream is a deeper truth. That love, real love, is not seamless. It stumbles, it misfires, it strains under the weight of difference. And perhaps the most intimate thing we can do is not to eliminate that strain, but to stay with it, to let the tension speak. This essay does not offer a solution to conflict, nor does it chart a path to perfect understanding. Instead, it lingers in the space where many relationships falter, the space where disagreement lives, where silence hardens, where tenderness meets resistance. Drawing on philosophy, psychoanalysis, and the small aches of the everyday, it explores what it means to love someone you cannot fully know and to stay in dialogue with that unknowing. There will be no neat arc, no tidy moral. Only the attempt to walk alongside a truth we often try to avoid. That intimacy is not a harmony we maintain, but a rhythm we learn to return to, especially when it falters. To love another is not simply to accept their presence, but to endure the unpredictable force of their difference. The fundamental dilemma of relational life lies not in conflict itself, but in the fantasy of its absence. What many call harmony is often a covert performance of suppression, an aesthetic of peace that masks the slow sediment of resentment. In truth, intimacy cannot preclude friction, it demands it. The very proximity that sustains affection also ensures collision, and to idealize the couple as a unit without contradiction is to deny the alterity that makes love possible. Philosophically, this tension reflects an enduring split between the Platonic ideal of unity and the Heraclitean vision of becoming. Where Plato might have seen love as a restoration of lost wholeness, Heraclitus would have insisted that all relation is flux, all stability provisional. In this light, disagreement within a couple is not a failure to be corrected, but a manifestation of the irreducibility of two consciousnesses meeting. Heidegger's notion of being with captures this tension. To exist with another is to be exposed to difference as an ontological condition. To flee from argument is to flee from this truth. And yet, the ethical demand of relationship is not to celebrate all conflict indiscriminately. Not every quarrel is generative. Not every silence is wise. There is a threshold beyond which disagreement becomes domination or contempt calcifies into cruelty. What is required is a praxis of argument that does not treat the other as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a horizon to be approached. To argue well is to hold fast to the belief that something shared, understanding, clarity, even affection, might emerge from the wreckage of disagreement. This is where psychoanalysis and relational ethics converge. The symptom is not the argument, but the refusal to have it. The couple that never fights may not be united in harmony, but in avoidance. Here, the Freudian return of the repressed operates not just within the individual, but between people. What is unspoken festers. What is staged as tranquility becomes a theatre of deferral. Thus, the philosophical act is not to eliminate conflict, but to transform it, to relocate it from the battlefield to the forum. The goal is not agreement, but recognition. A relationship endures not because two people always understand each other, but because they are willing to keep trying, even and especially when they do not. There is a kind of courage in the quiet moment before a disagreement begins. Not the theatrical kind, the one we imagine in grand declarations or moral clarity, but the subtler act of choosing to stay present when something starts to slip out of sync. Many couples never name this moment because to name it is to risk the very discomfort they've spent years learning to avoid. But intimacy, real intimacy, does not grow in the absence of friction. It grows in how we meet it. It's easy to think of conflict as rupture, a break in the harmony, but more often it is rhythm, a syncopation, a beat that doesn't land where we expected. And when we mishear it, when we mistake difference for disloyalty, tension for threat, we fall back on habits designed to protect, not to connect. Silence becomes weapon, agreement becomes disguise, and in the name of peace, we bury the parts of ourselves most in need of contact. This is where the philosophical tradition can offer not answers but shape. Emmanuel Levinas wrote of the face of the other as an ethical demand, not a request for understanding, but a summons to responsibility. To encounter another is not to decode them, but to acknowledge their irreducibility. In the realm of the couple, this means allowing the other to remain opaque. Not everything must be clarified. Not every difference needs to be solved. Some are to be respected in their resistance to absorption. Still, the temptation is always there to fix, to smooth, to reconcile. We say, let's not fight, as if fighting is the failure, but often it is the refusal to fight that corrodes. Not all quiet is peace. Some quiet is fear. Some silence is the trace of a voice that once tried and no longer does. In that space, the performance of calm becomes more dangerous than the presence of rage. At least, rage speaks. To stay in conversation, not just in words, but in the willingness to be altered by them, is to accept love not as a static agreement, but as a dynamic process. A becoming. We are not the same people we were yesterday, nor are they. And so to love again is to listen again, not just to the content of what is said, but to the shift in tone, the pause before reply, the thing that wasn't said but might have been. Recognition lives in the details, in the difference that persists, in the line we choose not to cross and the one we dare to, not because it is safe, but because it is honest. Sometimes the argument isn't about what it seems to be, the dishwasher, the holiday, the tone taken last Thursday. These are surface tensions, small waves masking deeper currents. What's often in dispute is not the object, but the meaning attacked, who feels seen, who feels safe, who feels valued in the act of being disagreed with. The real question is rarely, why didn't you do the thing, but do I matter enough to you that you noticed? And this is where things get slippery, because we've been taught that love should not require translation, but it does, again and again. Love is not a universal language. It is a dialect forged in context, revised in conflict, and never fully mastered. What comforts one person may constrain another. What reassures you might remind me of past hurt. The paradox is that to be close is to risk misunderstanding. And so every intimacy, no matter how enduring, carries within it the possibility of misattunement, not because something is wrong, but because something is alive. Relational theorists speak of rupture and repair as the central dance of secure attachment. What matters is not whether a break occurs, but whether it is named, tended, healed. Yet too often, the break is denied, papered over. We become fluent in avoidance. We learn to smile through the sting, to change the subject, to pretend it doesn't still ache. This avoidance is often born not of malice, but of fatigue. The quiet hope that if we don't name the fracture, it might mend itself. But it rarely does. In fact, the unspoken accumulates. It settles into the rhythm of daily life, reappearing not as confession, but as irritability, sarcasm, distance. This is the slow violence of unacknowledged pain. And it does more damage than any shouted truth ever could, because it teaches us to question not the other's actions, but our own perception, to wonder, did that really hurt? Was that really unfair? This self-doubt corrodes the foundation of relational trust. To interrupt this cycle requires not just communication, but recalibration, a return to the ethic of curiosity. Not why are you like this, but what have I missed? Not here's how you failed me, but here's where I lost track of you. These are not weak gestures. They are braver than silence and riskier than blame, because they imply we are willing to be wrong, to be changed, to let the argument alter not just the conversation, but the self that enters it. And perhaps that's the deeper invitation, not to avoid the fight, but to ask, what kind of person do I become when we argue like this? And is that someone I still want to be? There is a moment in every long-term relationship when the mythology starts to thin. Not collapse, exactly, just fade at the edges. The origin stories once told with sparkle now feel slightly rehearsed. The private languages begin to calcify. And beneath the rituals of love, morning coffee, goodnight kisses, texted check-ins, there is a soft grief for the version of us that once felt effortless. But maybe effortlessness was never the goal. Maybe what we mourn isn't its loss, but our reluctance to acknowledge its limits. Because what sustains a relationship over time is not the absence of effort, but the presence of attention, a practiced, deliberate turning toward. Philosopher Simone Weil called attention the rarest and purest form of generosity. And in love, it might be the most essential. Not grand gestures, not perfect attunement, but the quiet, ongoing act of noticing, the way someone exhales before speaking. The shift in posture when something lands wrong. The questions left unasked, not from disinterest, but from fear. This kind of noticing does not come naturally in a world engineered for distraction. We are taught to optimize, to multitask, to outsource the slow labor of presence. And yet, intimacy resists automation. It asks us to stay with the mundane, to make a home in the unfinished. It asks us to look again and again, not just at the other person, but at our own reactions to them. To wonder, what story am I telling about what they just said? And what would happen if I softened it? This is not to romanticize self-sacrifice or deny real harm. There are moments when the kindest act is to name the distance and let it stand. But far more often, the space between us is not filled with malice. It is filled with misread signals and unspoken longings. And if we can resist the impulse to resolve or retreat, we may find that the gap itself becomes a site of transformation. Because in the end, love is not about reducing the other to someone we can fully understand. It is about making peace with the fact that we cannot, and still choosing them, again and again. Not because they are easy to love, but because they are real, and because in our choosing, we become more real too. That's the paradox. We long for connection, but it is the friction, the awkwardness, the mismatch, the mess that keeps love awake, not smoothness, not certainty, but the rough, generous texture of being two. Most apologies arrive too late, not because they are insincere, but because they are shaped in the aftermath of hurt when the wound has already settled into narrative. By then, the apology is no longer just about the moment. It is about the silence that followed, the days it wasn't spoken, the emotional weather it failed to interrupt. And so, even the truest apology struggles under the weight of delay. It carries not just remorse, but the echo of having waited. But maybe this is inevitable. Maybe repair is always retrospective. Maybe we cannot know what we have broken until we feel the shape of the break inside someone else. And to feel that, to really feel it, is not the same as admitting fault. It is a relinquishing of self-containment, an agreement, however temporary, to let the other's reality rearrange our own. In that sense, repair is less about right and wrong and more about re-entry. Not explaining the intention, but asking what the impact was. Not defending the self, but becoming porous to someone else's memory. This requires more than empathy. It requires surrender. Because to hear how you've hurt someone is to lose, for a moment, the version of yourself you hoped was blameless. Psychoanalytic theory speaks of mutual recognition, not as a harmonious blending, but as a moment in which two subjectivities hold each other in tension without collapse. In love, this means staying with the discomfort of difference long enough for something new to emerge. A shared reality, not because it was always there, but because it was made through effort, through grief, through care. Yet, some differences do not yield to dialogue. Some are tectonic, cultural, historical, neurobiological. And here too, there is an ethical task to distinguish between the kind of difference that invites deepening and the kind that quietly erases. The test is not comfort, but expansion. Do I become more myself in your presence or less? Do our conflicts sharpen me into honesty or wear me down into performance? This discernment is hard to name because it lives in texture, in how we argue, not just that we do. A raised voice can be loving. A quiet tone can be cruel. The form of the disagreement matters less than its posture. Are we moving toward one another, even in anger? Or are we positioning ourselves for retreat? The fight, then, is not the enemy. The absence of willingness to fight well, that's the loss. Because when we stop trying to reach each other through the conflict, we stop believing that anything real can be built on the other side of it. What makes a relationship endure is not stability, but adaptability. The ability to reorient when the emotional ground shifts, to find new ways of being together when the old patterns no longer hold. This is harder than it sounds. Most of us enter relationships with invisible scripts, borrowed from family, culture, the faint residue of past loves. We think we're improvising, but we're often reciting. And when the other person doesn't follow our lines, we call it incompatibility rather than what it is, an invitation to co-author something new. But co-authorship requires more than negotiation. It requires a kind of narrative humility, a willingness to let go of the version of the story where you're always the misunderstood one, or the peacemaker, or the one who always bends. These roles protect us, but they also trap us. They make the relationship about winning or enduring instead of relating. And to relate is to risk revision of our expectations, of our defences, sometimes even of our desires. Desire, too, is subject to revision. We don't talk about this enough. We assume that once we love someone, the terms of that love will remain consistent. But people change. Needs change. What once felt nourishing may now feel stifling. What once sparked joy may now feel obligatory. And when these shifts occur, they often surface not as conversation, but as avoidance, withdrawal. A subtle thinning of attention, a slow erosion of presence. To name these shifts without blame is one of the highest relational skills. Not "you've changed," but "I no longer meet you in the same way." Not "you're distant," but "I feel unsure of how to find you right now." These sentences are not resolutions. They're bridges, and sometimes they're all that stands between distance and departure. Fromm described love not as a feeling, but as a practice, an art. And like any art, it requires technique, patience, self-awareness. The myth of effortless compatibility ignores this. It suggests that love should be easy if it's real. But ease is not the test. The real test is whether, when love becomes effortful, we still find it worthy of effort. To love someone in their change is to admit we do not own the version of them we first adored. That person is gone or transformed or folded into something else, and so are we. The continuity, if it exists, lies not in who we are, but in how we choose to meet each other across these shifts. Not as the same, but as still willing, still trying, still here. Not all arguments end in resolution. Some taper into silence. Others circle back months later, disguised as something new. A missed message, a slight overreaction, a look that lasts too long. These moments are not failures, they are traces. Signs that something still matters, even if we don't yet know how to name it. The mistake is to treat them as detours from the relationship rather than part of its terrain. Because love, in the end, is not a clean narrative. It is an ongoing reckoning with otherness, with the parts of another we cannot predict, cannot fix, cannot absorb. And to remain in love, not as an emotion but as a practice, is to remain open to being disrupted. Not constantly, not violently, but honestly. To let the other person's strangeness continue to matter, to let it change the shape of who we thought we were becoming. There is an ache to this, a sweetness too, the ache of knowing we will never fully arrive, and the sweetness of continuing anyway, staying not out of obligation or inertia, but because the very friction becomes a kind of intimacy, a shared space where neither party is fully at ease, yet both are still trying, still choosing. And so the question shifts. Not will we argue, but how will we hold each other when we do? Not how do we make this easy, but how do we make this real? Real in the sense that it includes the sharp edges. Real in the sense that it allows for re-entry after rupture. Real in the sense that it does not seek to flatten difference, but to honour it, even when it stings. The most enduring love stories are not those without conflict. They are the ones where conflict does not become exile, where the fight is not a fracture, but a form of return, where we argue not to win, but to stay close enough that difference can still be felt, still be spoken, still be met with something other than fear. Perhaps this is the quiet promise at the heart of any lasting relationship. Not that we will always understand each other, but that we will not stop trying, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, because to love another is not to dissolve into them, nor to stand untouched. It is to stand close again and again, even when the space between us is trembling, and to say simply, I'm still here. Are you? Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.